ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to be with you today, even though only virtually, and to present the collections of the Museo Egizio. But let me explain to you how our museum developed and it became the great collection it is today, and what is our role within the Egyptological world, and why we're so important. In this slide, you see a picture, a rendering actually, of our museum. We are housed in a very important Baroque building in the city center of Turin, and the museum occupies 4 floors of this Baroque building. The building came into being in the 17th century, and it functioned as a college. It was a place where a sort of board schools where the family of the aristocracy of Turin would send their children in order to be educated. From the end of the 18th century, it became the seat of the Academy of Science, and it was in 1824 that it became the Museo Egizio. From almost 200 years, we have developed, and I will go with you through the history of our museum, and it was in 2015 that we opened a museum completely renovated. When I arrived in the museum in 2014, we were undergoing a major renovation. 4 floors of the museum had to be rethought. There were 35,000 objects that had to be moved and go to another place. And the museum was transformed in a huge building place. So both the building had to be renewed, a new climatized system had to be installed, but in the meantime we had to move all the collections from one place to another. You see here the images of the very moment when the collection of the tomb of Ra was moved. Ra was Imi Erkaut Nesut, responsible for the works of the pharaoh, and we are the only museum in the world outside of Egypt that has a complete New Kingdom burial. We have all 467 objects which were found in the tomb of Ra. And you see here the very moment when the objects one by one were packed, carefully preserved and moved to the new display. Look at this moment when the Book of the Dead Papyrus was taken down the wall, and then can you imagine 14 meters papyrus who could not possibly move around the building. We couldn't possibly take it out, so we had to develop this wheel where to roll up the papyrus with more than 14 conservators looking at that. But at a certain point, the museum was transformed into a working place where more than 200 conservators were working. Objects had to be cleaned and to be rehydrated because we couldn't possibly move. And then the museum, little by little, became a real research center. We had to do CT scans, for instance, on all our mummies before we were moved. And it was not only in order to be able to do the new display, but was a fantastic opportunity for us to study and understand our collection. And so little by little, the building activities went on, and while some rooms were still behind, in many rooms the works were so far that allowed us to put the showcases and install the objects. And then we had an army of cleaners who were cleaning all night in order to enable us in the morning, when the dust was down, to refurbish some showcases. And so really, little by little, the miracle took place, and in 9 months we were able to refurbish the second most important collection after the one housed in Cairo, and the Museo Egizio came into its new life. But let me explain you, why is there such a huge collection in Turin? Why so many objects are housed outside of Egypt? And why in this city in northern Italy? Well, this story started 400 years ago when this beautiful piece that you see now, the so-called Mensa Isiaca, arrived at the museum. Well, actually, I should say arrived in Turin. What you see now is a bronze table representing the god Isis in the center, surrounded by other Egyptianized divinities with some kind of hieroglyphs. Actually, they're not real hieroglyphs, they are imitation of hieroglyphs. This bronze table was made not in Egypt but in Rome in the first century AD, and it was probably the place where offers were put in the temple dedicated to Isis in the center of Rome. It was found in the 16th century and saved by the ransack of the Germans. It went then to the northern city of Mantua, and before 1626 it was donated to Turin. Actually, arriving in Turin the right moment, Turin had become the capital of the ducate in 1563, before the capital was Chambéry, and the ruling family, needed a myth to legitimize and justify the role of Turin. What a better story than to say that Turin was founded by the Egyptians. The arrival of this wonderful bronze table, the retrieval of some Egyptianizing objects in the city, and the retrieval in the 18th century of the temple devoted to Isis in the Roman city of Industria, well, all these elements work in making up the myth that Turin was founded by the Egyptian. So we can say actually that thanks to the Mensa Isiaca, which arrived 400 years ago, we have the museum now, and I'm able to talk to you tonight, and I'm not out of job, because actually thanks to this, the fascination of Turin with Egypt started, and that's the reason that we are still existing nowadays. More than 100 years later, in 1759, the then royal family, the Savoy family, sent this gentleman that we see represented here to Egypt. His name is Vitaliano Donati. He was sent to Egypt to find elements that could explain the Mensa Isiaca. So there was still these objects, these mysterious objects, and the royal family, to start with, was very curious to understand what was represented there. Vitaliano Donati went to Egypt and he collected more than 600 objects, among which this beautiful representation of the goddess Isis. When you look at the way the eyes are represented, the slightly curved nose, the fully lips, and the little chin, they are all elements typical of the 18th dynasty, because who is represented here actually is Queen Tia, the wife of Amenophis III, and the grandmother of King Tutankhamun. This is one of the most important statues that we have in our collection, and one of those who reached Turin in the very early days, 1759. So we are 40 years before the Napoleonic expedition. And this statue welcomes the visitors to the museum and remind us of how our history and how our connection to the past is very important. Not only connection to ancient Egypt, but also connection with 200 years of history that explains our existence nowadays. But let me introduce you to some other key figures in the formation of the collection. To our left, we see Bernardino Drobetti, Consul General of France, who worked in Egypt during the time of Napoleon, and he stayed on in after the fall of Napoleon. He worked with Muhammad Ali, and actually, like the diplomats of the time, he had the kind of hobby of going to the necropolis, collect antiquities, and then sell them in the antiquity market. Actually, we are in a period which we call the era of the consuls because all the diplomats were collecting antiquities. We talk about Bernardino Drovetti, but think about Harry Salt, the Salt collection in London, or the Anastasi collection in Leiden in the Netherlands. Well, Salt was consul general of Britain, while Anastasi was consul general on Norway and Sweden. Well, Bernardino Drovetti, working for France, he was, though, native of Barbania, a little town nearby Turin. In 1819, this honored gentleman up here, Carlo Vidua, went to Egypt and saw a list of Drovetti collection. He then wrote to the King of Sardinia. At that time, in 1819, Italy did not exist as a unified country. We were unified much later in 1861, but Italy was divided in 7 different little countries, and one of them was the Kingdom of Sardinia, with the capital in Turin. So Carlo Vidua wrote to the King of Sardinia, asking him to buy this collection. And he said, only if we buy this collection, Italy, and think at that time Italy did not exist as a unified political entity, will be a great country, because we will have the most important Egyptian collection in Turin, the most important gallery of art in Florence, and the most important gallery of antiquities, classical antiquities, in Rome. And it's also interesting to see how these 3 cities, Turin, Florence, and Rome, they all became capital of the country. And finally, in 1870, Rome became the capital of Italy. The king was, at that time, this gentleman that you see on the right, Victor Emmanuel I. He abdicated in 1823. He had agreed to buy the collection, and his brother, who became king, Carlo Felice, decided to buy the Drovetti collection. Almost 6,000 antiquities for the price of 400,000 Piemontese lira. If we want to translate the value in money nowadays, we could say that the value is of 60 million euros. A huge amount of money. But let me tell you, it's even more significant if we think that it was 3/4 of the budget of the Kingdom of Sardinia. Can you imagine investing 3/4 of the richness of a country into a collection? It meant to have a vision. You can figure out that I always use this kind of argument with the Minister of Culture in Italy, whenever he tells me, don't worry, we have increased the amount of money for culture this year. And I tell him all the time, well, you have a long way to go before you decide to invest 3/4 of what we produce on a year based on culture. But in doing that, Carlo Felice made Turin the capital of Egyptology forever. And well, in a room devoted to the history of the museum, we go back to that time and we try to understand how the museum was at that time. It was a place for scholars where scholars would come to study and understand the ancient past. You see then a representation of the then director, Ariodante Fabretti, standing and trying to read a stele, and seated behind him, there is Lanzone, who wrote the first religious and mythological dictionary. So the museum not as a place for visitors, but as a place for scholars who could study the material culture, understand ancient Egypt, and train their students. And at the center of this room, we have one of the most important documents preserved in this collection. It's called the Turin Papyrus, or even referred to as the Royal Canon. It's a list of 77 kings, starting from King Nama, going all the way to the Ramesside period. When Jean-François Champollion, the one who deciphered the hieroglyphs, saw for the first time these fragments, he wrote on a letter, "I barely dare to breathe," in the assumption that my breath could erase forever the names of kings which have survived for millennia. He understood that this was a very important chronological document, that thanks to this document, we were able to rebuild the chronology of ancient Egypt, to understand how it all started, where the kings that ruled that country. This document is of such an importance that, God forbid, if somebody would tell me that the museum is on fire, the museum is total loss, that I have to decide which document to save, I would for sure say this one, because it's at the foundation of our discipline and the history of ancient Egypt. Well, and how was the museum at that time? Let's see a drawing of what we call nowadays the galleries of kings. Actually, we call it the galleries of kings because the father of Egyptology, Jean-François Champollion, the one who deciphered the hieroglyphs in 1822, in September, he ran to his brother and he said, I have the solution. Finally, we are able again to read the hieroglyphs. Well, in 1824, only 2 years after his decipherment, he arrived in Turin. He was not pleased that the collection had arrived to Turin, to Italy, and was not in France. And he wrote that Italians are known to being lazy, and it was such a pity that this collection was here and not in France, where it would have been studied properly. And then when he arrived and he saw this statue housed in the gallery, he said, what a wonderful assembly of gods and divinities. And then he said, but then a history of art does exist, because we should not forget that at that time, people would think that the only art, ancient art, that could be defined as such was Greek art. And everything that was before that was kind of primitive and not refined enough. And so actually Champollion, the father of Egyptology, realized actually the history of art in ancient Egypt does exist. And in looking at a statue on the back, where the statue represents Ramses II, he called it the Apollo Belvedere of ancient Egypt. Here is Jean-François Champollion, the one who realized that the royal canon was such an important document, the one who tested his theory of the translation of decipherment hieroglyphs on the monuments that were here, the one who was capable of understanding that history of art of ancient Egypt existed.